Breaking tonight, the numbers are in, and Mark Carney's biggest political gamble just delivered its loudest receipt yet. Canadian canola exports for the week ending May 3 hit 315,600 tons. That's the highest weekly figure of the entire crop year. It's a 63% jump from the week before, and it puts the 2025-26 export total at 6.5 million tons, closing the gap on last year's pace after months of pain in Western Canada. Tonight on his social media account, the Prime Minister of Canada wrote 8 words. Our trade agreement with China is delivering for Canadian farmers. 8 words, no exclamation marks, no victory lap, just a number that speaks louder than any speech. But to understand what's really happening here, you have to look at what else is happening on the same day. Because at the very moment Carney was posting those 8 words from Ottawa, Air Force One was touching down in Beijing. Donald Trump arrived in China today. He brought Apple's Tim Cook with him. He brought Elon Musk. And he brought Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, added to the trip at the last minute on a stopover in Alaska. The same Donald Trump who, in January of this year, told the world that China would eat Canada alive if Carney signed a deal with Beijing. The same Donald Trump who threatened a 100% tariff on every Canadian export crossing the border if Ottawa dared to do exactly what Ottawa did. 4 months later, Trump is in Beijing himself, looking for soybean orders. Dear viewers, sit with that for a moment. Let's go back to the beginning. March 20, 2025. China fired the first shot. A 100% tariff slammed down on Canadian canola oil, canola meal, and peas. A 25% wall went up on Canadian pork and seafood. Retaliation, Beijing called it. Retaliation against the 100% tariff Justin Trudeau had stamped on Chinese electric vehicles the previous August, in lockstep with Washington. Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister on March 14, 2025. 6 days into the job, the canola belt was already on fire. The damage came in waves. Saskatchewan farmers, who grow most of this country's canola, watched billions in export value start to drain. Storage bins filled, prices cratered. Family operations that had been planning for retirement started planning for survival. Then came the second shoe. August 14, 2025. China dropped a 75.8% anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola seed itself, the rawest, highest volume product in the entire chain. Canola seed exports to China didn't slow. They effectively went to zero. By September, the largest Canadian agricultural export market on the planet had been bricked over. This is the inheritance Carney walked into. A trade war Canada didn't start, triggered by an EV tariff Trudeau imposed the previous August, against a partner Ottawa had spent a decade calling a strategic competitor, with no clear off-ramp and an American neighbor simultaneously trying to crush Canadian industry from the other direction. So Carney did something nobody in Canadian politics had done in 9 years. He got on a plane and flew to Beijing. In January of this year, the Prime Minister landed in the Chinese capital with Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe at his side and the federal cabinet behind him. He sat in the Great Hall of the People. He shook hands with Xi Jinping, and he came home with a deal. Here's what it said. China would slash its canola seed tariff from a combined 84% down to 15% by March 1, 2026. Beijing would lift the 100% duties on canola meal, plus the 25% walls on peas, lobster, and crab, at least through the end of this year. Canadian beef, locked out of China since 2021, would flow again. And Ottawa, in exchange, would let 49,000 Chinese-built electric vehicles into the Canadian market at a 6.1% tariff, roughly 3% of total annual vehicle sales in this country. Translation: Canada traded a tightly capped corner of its EV market for the resurrection of an entire agricultural export sector. The reaction from Washington was instantaneous, and it was venomous. Donald Trump posted that Canada was systematically destroying itself. He called the agreement one of the worst trade deals in history. He threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Carney went through with it. Carney didn't blink. Days later, he stood up at the World Economic Forum in Davos and told a room full of world leaders that middle powers had to act together, because if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. He didn't name Trump. He didn't have to. And then March 1st arrived. The tariffs dropped exactly as written. Ships started loading at the port of Vancouver. The first 60,000-ton canola seed order from China was confirmed within a week. The first loads of Canadian beef in 5 years began shipping toward Chinese ports. If you've been following the canola story closely, lock in our updates while the trade picture is still shifting. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We track every move on the Canada-China file in real time, and you'll see the headlines here first. Now look at what the numbers say. In March alone, the very first month tariffs came off, China imported 369,000 tons of Canadian canola. That single month outpaced the total purchases from the previous 7 months combined, which sat at just 333,000 tons. April pulled in roughly 1 million tons of total Canadian canola exports, and China was again the dominant buyer. Then came last week, the week ending May 3rd. 315,600 tons shipped in 7 days. That single weekly figure is 90,000 tons above the previous 5-week average. The 2025-26 export pace, which sat 1.7 million tons behind last year's run rate on March 1st, is now just 1.3 million tons behind, and the gap is closing every week. Dear viewers, this is what a trade strategy that works actually looks like. It doesn't always announce itself with a parade. Sometimes it shows up quietly in a grain commission spreadsheet, in a Yorkton crushing plant running at full capacity, in a Panamax tanker leaving Vancouver Harbor, bound for Dalian on the Yellow Sea. Which brings us back to Beijing tonight. Donald Trump landed in the Chinese capital this morning. A brass band played on the tarmac. Skyscrapers along the motorcade route were lit up with Chinese characters, meaning, Beijing, welcome. Vice President Han Zheng greeted him as Musk and Huang looked on. Trump is scheduled to meet Xi Jinping tomorrow at the Great Hall of the People, followed by a tour of the Temple of Heaven and a state banquet. Reuters, Bloomberg, CNBC, and Al Jazeera all report the same expectation. The United States is hoping to come home with large Chinese orders of American planes and American soybeans. Translation: the American president, who 4 months ago threatened to destroy Canada's economy for cutting a deal on canola, is now in Beijing trying to cut a deal on soybeans, which happens to be canola's direct competitor in the global vegetable oil market. Let that sink in. And here's how veteran Canadian journalist Steve Paikin framed the same moment. Quote, "Maybe the trip to China will be helpful to Donald Trump, but it may not be helpful to his allies who may think it's passing strange that he seems to get along so well with other dictators in the world and not very well with his fellow Democratic leaders." End quote. Passing strange. That is the diplomatic version of saying the quiet part out loud. The American president gets along beautifully with Xi Jinping, with Putin, with Kim Jong-un, with Carney, with Macron, with Starmer. Not so much. The hugs go to the autocrats. The tariffs and the insults go to the democracies, which is precisely the world Carney built his China strategy for. Because here's what tonight's numbers really tell us. The Carney pivot to China wasn't naive, and it certainly wasn't, as Trump claimed at the time, Canada selling itself out. It was a cold, clear-eyed read of where global trade was actually heading. Carney saw what Trump was telling him in real time. The Kuzma review was coming this summer. The tariff threats weren't ending. The American market was no longer reliable, no longer rules-based, no longer the safe harbor it had been for 80 years. So Ottawa moved, not away from the United States, but toward leverage, toward a Canada that could say no to Washington because it finally had somewhere else to say yes. And the receipts have started arriving. A canola farmer outside Grand Prairie, Alberta, who told CBC in January he was cautiously optimistic, is now watching the cash register ring. In Saskatchewan, a crushing plant that ran below capacity last fall is booked solid into summer. Port of Vancouver loading data shows the kind of throughput nobody has seen since 2023. And Statistics Canada confirmed that the first quarter of 2026 already had Canadian canola exports up 10% over the same period last year. This is not a victory tour. There are serious questions still on the table. The tariff cut runs only through the end of 2026. There's no permanent deal yet. Canola oil tariffs remain in place. Pork was not included in the agreement. And China remains a partner with a long memory and shifting priorities. Carney's team knows all of this. So do the producers. Andre Harp, who chairs the Canadian Canola Growers Association, used the phrase cautiously optimistic for a reason. This is still a trade truce, not a trade peace. But what last week's numbers prove, and what tonight's Trump arrival in Beijing makes impossible to ignore, is that Canada bet on diversification at exactly the right moment. While the Americans were threatening Ottawa, the Chinese were buying Canadian product. Canadian farmers were filling Chinese orders during the exact months Trump was calling Carney weak. And when Washington insisted Canada had to pick a side between its two largest trading partners, Carney quietly picked CA, nada. That's the doctrine you're watching get built in real time. A Canada that operates as a middle power with its own seat at the table and its own price for what it brings. Not anti-American, Carney has been crystal clear that the relationship with Washington remains existential, but not subordinate to it either. A country that finally figured out the most dangerous place to stand in a fight between two giants is directly between them with no other doors open. Stay with us this week. We're tracking every signal coming out of Beijing, the soybean numbers, the rare earth conversations, the Taiwan language, the chip carve-outs. And we'll break down what each move means for Ottawa, for the canola belt, for the Canadian dollar, and for the next round of CUSMA talks. This is the part of the story the cable networks south of the border won't tell you. We will. Tomorrow, Trump and Xi sit down across a table in the Great Hall of the People, the same room where Carney sat 4 months ago. The Americans will be asking for the same kind of agricultural breakthrough the Canadians already secured. The difference is that Canada didn't have to threaten anybody to get it. 8 words on a Carney post tonight: 315,600 tons in a single week. One prime minister in Ottawa watching the spreadsheets. One president in Beijing chasing a photo op. And one country, this country, quietly proving that middle powers can write their own future when they have the nerve to act before the headlines force them to. This is Canada Next. I'll see you tomorrow.